All right, so good morning, everyone, again. So today marks our last day of these 5 Senses of Faith sermon series that we started a few weeks ago. We've talked about so far sight, we've talked about hearing, we've talked about taste and smell, and so that leaves us finally today, we have touch, the sense of touch. And so today we're going to be focusing our attention on Mark, the 5th chapter, verses 21 to 43. The accounts of the event that we're going to be talking about today is actually recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in all three. However, I do feel that in the Gospel of Mark, we get a little bit more detail to help us with this story. So I'm going to read directly from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, and after we read this whole section, we will begin to discuss it. So beginning again in Mark, the 5th chapter, starting in verse 21, Mark says, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you,' his disciple answered, 'and yet you can ask, Who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be free from your suffering.' While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. 'Your daughter is dead,' they said. 'Why bother with the teacher anymore?' Overhearing what they had said, Jesus said to him, 'Don't be afraid, just believe.' He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, 'Why all this commotion and wailing? This child is not dead, but asleep.' But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha kum,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, get up.' Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat." I thought it'd be worth the time to read all of that just so we can become familiar with this passage if we haven't already become familiar with this story. In the beginning here, we're introduced to a synagogue leader, as it says in the beginning, Jairus. And if we put ourselves in the shoes of Jairus right in the beginning of the story, he's at his last straw. He doesn't know what else to do. He's seeking the help of Jesus to heal his daughter. And this just goes to show where his faith was. His faith lied in Jesus alone. Most of us, when our backs are against the wall, most of us, when we feel like we are no longer in control of the situation or we cannot do anything, we're helpless, we turn to different things, we turn to different people to get us through the hard times. And Jairus had a daughter, 12-year-old daughter, as we will find out, who was dying. And for parents to think about this today, if you were to think about your young child who's in a really bad situation or who's undergoing a really bad medical issue and is dying, you are going to do whatever you possibly can to get that child to be okay. There's a lot of stories of people who have suffering loved ones, and they'll go as far as to sell their car, to sell their house, to pay for whatever medical expenses they can possibly pay so that way their child can be healed. Because in this situation, there was nothing that Jairus could physically do. Jairus couldn't do anything. He couldn't help his daughter. Sometimes we're faced with situations in our life, and it may not be as drastic as this one. We may not be in a situation where we have a loved one who's dying, but we may be in situations where we are helpless. We cannot do anything. We feel like we are not in control. And it is in those times that God tells us that we need to have faith in him, that we need to seek God and seek his healing. And so looking back in this passage of Mark, the 5th chapter, looking back at verses 22 and 23, Mark writes, "Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.'" Back in this time with Jesus, he had been going through a lot, or demonstrating a lot of miracles to the people that he passed, healing the sick and, restoring the sight of the blind, doing these incredible things. And Jairus saw these things happening. He knows who Jesus is. And even though he's in this incredible, he's a leader, Jairus is a leader in the synagogue, and he's an administrator. He has all this power, but yet he still didn't know what to do. And so he sought for Jesus. He sought for what he had seen already. He sees the wonderful miracles that Jesus was doing, and so he had faith that he could heal his daughter. Jairus believed that Jesus could and that Jesus would help him. And I mean, you think about this in this situation, his daughter is dying, and instead of attending to her, a lot of times if we know someone's dying or if we know somebody's in a really bad place, we'll try to spend every second that we can with that person. You see a lot of people in hospice, or a lot of people who are on their deathbed, so forth. Their family members will sit right next to the bed, and they'll sit with them for as long as they can and hold their hand, because they want to be in their presence. They want to show the person, I care for you, and they want to be next to them. But instead here, Jairus kind of leaves his daughter where she is because he's at his last straw. He doesn't know what to do, so he leaves. He leaves her behind because he has so much faith that if he can get to Jesus, if he can get Jesus to come to his daughter, that Jesus will be able to heal him. Looking at Jeremiah, the 32nd chapter, verse 27, the Lord says, "I am the Lord, the God of all mankind." And then he asks the question, he says, "Is there anything too hard for me?" And then in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, it says, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." God is saying, "I am the Lord. Is there anything too hard for me? You need to seek me, and you shall find me." This is what he's saying. We must believe. And I think what's incredible about this story so far, even, and just Jairus alone, is that he teaches us that sorrow can come to all people. It doesn't matter your situation in life. It doesn't matter your status in life. Jairus was a leader, an administrator. He had power. He had resources. He probably in those times had the money. You think about these people who have all the money in the world, but sometimes you will be put in a situation where it doesn't matter your situation. It doesn't matter your status in life. It doesn't matter what you have. You may not be able to get through things, and you may just need to seek Jesus. In our times of sorrow and pain, we should come to Jesus like Jairus for help, because we have a promise. In Psalm, the 50th chapter, verse 15, it reads, "And call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me." And then again, if we read in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, it reads, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our times of need." That if we seek God, if we look for God, we will find mercy, we will find grace in him that will help us in our times of need. Looking back in these verses, you see it only makes sense. It makes sense to come to the Lord when we need help, because he can and he will deliver us. And so if we look back in Mark chapter 5, verses 25, Mark says, "So Jesus went with him." Jesus took time to go with this brokenhearted father, but a crowd began to focus around Jesus. As we continue in verse 24, Mark tells us that a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And I can only imagine in this situation how frustrating this must have been for Jairus, because your daughter is sick, in need of help, and he leaves her and he wants to find Jesus so Jesus can help her. And he finds Jesus, And Jesus says, okay, let's go. We're going to go heal her. And as soon as he does that, he's surrounded by a group of people. So much so, it's like you're stuck in traffic. You can't move. But if there's anything that we can learn from this situation, because I think this is very relevant to us today, oftentimes when we are in struggles, when we are in a situation where we seek the Lord's help and we need the Lord's help, we feel like we're the only ones going through something like this. But this just goes to show us that we are not the only one in need of Jesus' help. All these people who crowded around Jesus, they knew that he had this ability to heal people, that he was helping those who needed help, and Jairus finally got him to help him. He was going to go on their way to the daughter, and then all these people come around because all these people needed his help as well. And if there's anything we can learn about this frustrating moment that Jairus must have been in, is we are not always the only one who is in need of help. There are a lot of people in need of help, and a lot of people who need to seek Jesus just like we do. But as this large crowd focuses around Jesus, in the midst of this crowd was a woman. And as we can read in Mark, the 5th chapter again, verses 25 to 28, it reads, "And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." It's crazy to me in this situation, and we talked about this last week, how I was going to, it turned out I actually made this sermon specifically about this story. But what's crazy is Jesus is in this crowd of people. He has no room to walk freely. He's tightly compact, like you're at a concert and there's just so many people around you, you can barely move. But he still feels somebody touch him. He knows that something happened, that somebody touched him. And to think about why she touched him. Why did she think that just touching him? Of course, he's been touching people and healing people and showing people his powers of healing to other people. But as we look more into what is going on with this one individual woman, as it says in Mark, the 5th chapter, verse 25, that she had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. For 12 years. She had a condition that allowed or disallowed her to come into physical contact with other people. According to the law of Moses in the Old Testament, her condition exempts her from any physical contact with other people. She would be regarded as being ritually unclean. And you can read this in Leviticus, the 15th chapter, verses 25 to 28. She would be ritually unclean, that anyone she touched would also be unclean. And because of this condition, she was cut off, alienated from the likes of her people. She was isolated, unable to come into physical contact. But regardless of any of that, regardless of knowing this law, she had faith in Jesus that he would and that he could heal her. Because she had already done all that she could. If we look right back in verse 26, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, had spent all she had, all the money she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And I know it's funny looking at this verse and looking at this passage here, because we're in a world now where medicine is evolving every single day and we have incredible medical advancements. We live in a nation who's made incredible strides in practices, techniques, cures, treatments for basically anything you can think of. Just the other day that they released a new treatment that's been working to rid HIV in people. Something that's been known to be incurable, and the second person has just been found to have no traces of it after the treatment that they have. So we feel like we may not even have to worry when we get sick. It's like, I don't have to worry about it because I can get better. I know I can get better. Back in the old days, they didn't have the stuff that we have now, and so if you got sick, you better have someone to heal you. You better have Jesus to come heal you, or you better find some medical treatment to help you here. But we don't really have to worry. We have to worry in a sense now that we need to seek help. We still need to seek help to get better, but for the most part, there's a cure. There's a treatment for most things that we experience. But back in these days, medicine was not even close to as impactful as it is now. Like it says, this woman had been under the care of multiple doctors. Not a single one could help her. Those were either horrible doctors or she was, I don't even know. I mean, under the care of multiple doctors. You think about that now, it's like, if you have a condition and you've seen 10 doctors and none of them can help you, then wow, I'd be hopeless. I wouldn't have any clue what to do. But despite her lack of faith, because you have to think, if you have a condition and you've seen multiple doctors and nobody has been able to help you, I'd be pretty hopeless. I'd have a complete lack of faith that anyone's going to be able to help me. But despite her lack of faith from these doctors that have tried, she still had faith that Jesus could deliver her from her suffering. Because you think about it, all she did was reach out and touch his cloak. Of course, you see the wonders that Jesus has been doing in this time, but to be seen by multiple doctors who are showing her these different strategies and techniques to treat you, and then what ends up healing her is just a touch of the cloak. It almost seems irrational. It doesn't seem like it's real. That's unbelievable. Sometimes we may be afflicted with some trouble in our life that may not necessarily be an illness. It may not necessarily be something like this, but we could have a loved one who is sick. We could just be going through something completely different, a different trouble, where we have sought the help of others, we've sought the help of man and have gotten nowhere. But then, again, God reminds us in his word that if we come to him and if we believe that we will receive what we ask of him and that we will be delivered. And so the woman, anxiously finding her way through the crowd, gets to Jesus, and in verses 28 and 29 we read, "Because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. But this did not go unnoticed." We need to know that this did not go unnoticed. Continuing in verse 30, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. And this is just funny. It just makes me feel like he touched her and like just surge just went through him, and he was like I don't even know. That's how I just feel like this is what it's saying. He immediately felt that power leave him, like as if it was being sucked out of him. He just felt it leave him, and he turned around in the crowd. He says, "Who touched me?" He's surrounded by a bunch of people, but he's like, "Who touched me?" Like it wasn't just a regular touch. He knew something had happened. And so the disciples say that in verse 31, you see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" Like, how can you even ask that? There's probably 20 people brushing against you and doing all this. What are you talking about? But the woman knew, and Jesus knew. Because as we read in 32, but Jesus kept looking around. He kept looking to see who had done it. And in verse 33, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. Trembling with fear. She was completely misunderstanding why Jesus was looking. He wasn't trying to scold her for touching him. Verse 34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be free from your suffering." No, he wasn't trying to scold her. Jesus says to her, "Your faith has healed you." He wanted her to recognize that the fact that her faith in him is what caused that healing. It wasn't just his cloak. It wasn't a magical cloak. She had faith. She believed that he would and that he could heal her, and so he did. Because you think about it, Jesus could have just healed the woman and kept on walking to his original destination. He didn't have to stop. He and the woman would have known what had taken place, and that's all it would have been. She would have been healed. He would have carried on with his day, but he didn't. He stopped what he was doing. He acknowledged the result of this woman's faith, that her complete and instantaneous healing was a result of her faith. And it was in that moment in the story that others from the house of Jairus, we kind of digress from her, others from the house of Jairus come down towards them. And if we continue to read in verse 35, while Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. They said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" And overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." listening to this response of Jesus kind of reminds me when we talked about the parting of the Red Sea with Moses, and how as Moses approached the sea with the Israelites behind him, the Israelites had no idea what to do. They began to panic. They're like, we're heading towards the sea. We have no idea how we're going to cross this. What's going to happen? They had no idea what to possibly do at this point, and so they complained to Moses. Like I said, when we are backed up against the wall, sometimes we begin to complain because we don't know what to do. But if we remember in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13, Moses responds to the Israelites and he says, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." And is this not what Jesus is saying to Jairus? He was just brought news that his daughter had died. I mean, you think about that. He left his daughter behind to find Jesus so that way he could have her healed. And as he has this man who's going to heal his daughter, but they're trapped in this crowd of people, they're heading there. People come down and they said, "She died. Don't even bother anymore. You tried your best, but she's gone." And I can only imagine, the instant anxiety, the instant grief, the guilt that he left her and he wasn't by her side. But Jesus says to Jairus, just as Moses said to the Israelites, "Do not be afraid, just believe." Just believe, emphasizing the fact that if we believe, the impossible can be done. And these are just such beautiful words coming from the mouth of Jesus. But if we continue to read in verse 37, it says, "He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, 'Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep.' But they laughed at him." They laughed at him. These people laughed, thinking she's dead. Who is this man, this carpenter, who's going to come in here and say that she's just sleeping? He must be insane. That's what they're probably thinking. What would be insane is in the midst of all this, the little girl just sat up after they all knew she was dead. If she just sat up and yawned and, was like, "I was just resting. What are you guys, Mom, why are you crying? Like, I was just sleeping." But that would be insane because they knew she was dead. But no, the little girl was said to be dead. Still, Jesus still says to the people that she's asleep. And why do you think that he says that? Why do you think he says she's not dead? She's merely asleep. And I think that there's kind of beauty behind why Jesus says this to them, trying to make them feel comforted, to feel hope. Because when we think of the word death, when we think of that word, the meaning of death, it's a very cold, it's a very harsh word. We can almost feel it. We can feel it inside us. If death was a word that we could just float out into space and touch it, it'd be cold and dark, and it's just the feeling behind the word is just dark. But we think of sleep, and it's so much different. When we think of sleep, it's quiet, it's humble, it's soft, it's warm, it's calm. And so Jesus tells the people that she's just sleeping. But if we continue in verse 40, Mark says, after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with them and went in where the child was. He kicked everybody out. He wanted just these people. He said, let's go in, just us, and I kick everyone out. In verse 41, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And in verse 42, the impossible is done. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. And at this time they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, can you just imagine how stunned you would be in this moment? Your child, your daughter is dead. Just here, dead. And Jesus speaks to them, tells them, orders them not to say what had been done. Leave it be. Don't say anything. But Matthew chapter 9, verse 26 says that the report of this went out into all the land. They could not keep this to themselves, and they spoke about it. They spoke to the world. Jesus can bring life to the dead. Just like that, their tears of sorrow turned into tears of joy. Jesus' touch brought life back to their daughter. But you see, it was never about the touch. It was never just the touch. Sure, Jesus healed people. He brought people back to life, or he maybe restored the sight of the blind by touching them. But it was never about the touch. In a way it was, because that was the way that they were healed. That was the way that Jairus' daughter was healed. But more so, the story is about faith. It was the faith of Jairus that brought him to Jesus. And it was that which led to Jesus saving and ultimately healing the daughter. And let's not forget about the woman in the crowd. While today we are not physically touched by Jesus in the same sense that we read here today, we are touched by God every time we read and we hear his word. Because we think to touch something is to be connected, to come so close to something that you are in contact, to be connected with something. And so when we read God's word, we read it like he's speaking to us, like he is reaching into our hearts, causing us to grow into stronger and healthy Christians. Back in 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, chapter 10, verse 26, it reads, "And Saul also went to his house at Gibeah, and the valiant men whose hearts God had touched went with him." And you listen to that closely. The men whose hearts God had touched. God touches our heart every time we hear him, every time we see him, every time we taste him. God is touching our heart. Talk about bringing all of our senses together. When we see him in his word, when we hear his word, when we taste his word, God touches our heart. In Proverbs, the 23rd chapter, verse 26, it reads, "My son, give me your heart and let your eyes delight in my ways." God wants our heart. He wants to bring us his word. He wants to bring us, to give us his wisdom. And it's through his word that we are touched by God. It's through our faith, like the woman in the crowd, like Jairus. It is through our faith that we seek Jesus, that we seek God, that we trust that he can, that he will deliver us from our troubles. But that's what we have to do. We have to have faith. We have to trust in him. We have to believe that what we ask, we will be given. And only then can we be touched, can we be healed by the loving power of God. And so